This sort of topic that I've selected, let me see if I can make this work, is really sort of a culmination of starting off as an ecosystem scientist, traveling the world and looking at the impacts of climate and land use change on various ecosystems, and really realizing, I'm a slow learner, that it really takes that integration of social science and physical science to really provide solutions. And so what I'll try to do is sort of walk you through some of those journeys and highlight some of the things that have been compelling me to look at a more integrative approach. Sort of the outline of this talk will be looking at, what are, what's the condition of the commons, look at some of the pathways that we're using, especially related to examples of water, food, and energy as examples of sustainable development strategies that are being undertaken both at a global level and way of international partnerships, as well as looking at some local examples, because it's my belief, and I think a lot of you also adhere to this, that it is that local action, especially as we look at adaptation actions that are really important, how we as a society really engage efforts to mitigate some of the climate changes and take opportunities of some of the environmental changes that we view around the world. I'll talk briefly, though, because it's not my strength, but talk briefly about some of the economic and some of the social costs, the toll in which that we may have to pay or are paying for the type of changes that we're dealing with, and some of the fixes that we're going to need to prepare for and to make. And then finally, a summary, sort of a call for action. And so as we look at these considerations, we understand that as we look at the environment around the world, aspects of societal needs related to energy, food, and water are really tightly coupled, and that understanding the manner in which social-ecological systems interact is really necessary to both understand how we actually can use and conserve our natural resources, our ecosystem services, as well as then look forward to look at solutions of how do we actually do this in a sustainable fashion. Human appropriation of ecosystem services have been increasing at a really dramatic rate. It's over 25% of net primary productivity globally around the world. Helmut Haberl and his colleagues at Vienna have really been quantifying this, and I'll give you some examples of how they've been measuring the human appropriation of MPP and how what that implies toward the changes in the biogeochemical cycles, changes in our marine and our land systems. One thing that also is a concern is the rate of despite our best efforts, the rate of emissions continue to rise. And so that even though our efficiencies and our conservation efforts have improved, but because of our changing consumption patterns and the growth of emerging economies, the emissions globally of fossil fuel emissions continue to grow and really hamper our ability to manage the Earth system. And this is coupled with the mass extinction that we're undertaking now, and we're seeing large-scale biodiversity losses throughout the world. And that combination of human activities, both in land use change and climate change, are aspects of that will, the next few slides will reveal. The work by Rockström and others is a quite collection of stellar individuals who really came together in this paper, really landmark paper to really articulate the broad impacts that human activities display across the world. And in particular, this issue of biodiversity loss is quite dramatic as they evaluate this. And this is, a lot of this effort was compiled by the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment that Christine had mentioned. In addition, we're changing the biological cycle in a number of ways. Now, and this kind of depicts what we know about the nitrogen cycle, and I'll touch on this again later in another slide. But in addition to nitrogen, the manner in which that we're consuming, using, and decreasing the amount of available phosphorus is actually quite dramatic as well. And so in a number of ways, although we focus a lot on carbon emissions and carbon fossil fuel uses, this whole issue of phosphorus and nitrogen is something that, from the biogeochemical perspective, sort of my root scientific background, is really a concern of how these accelerated cycles are impacting the Earth system, both in the aquatic and the atmospheric realm, and how will we sort of look to provide available phosphorus for systems as they lose them, especially with the phosphorus cycle, because there's less processes and access to reactive and available phosphorus than there is for nitrogen. And then, of course, you know, a lot of us are familiar with the type of climate changes that we're seeing. So collectively, we're seeing a number of different sectors within our Earth system being impacted. And a lot of these, because they're so undervalued, and they're so, you know, as society and civilization really expanded, they were free. And so these were sort of common goods in way of atmosphere, land, aquatic and marine resources that we took advantage of and sort of consumed at an ever alarming rate. Just as a reminder, we're seeing, you know, a concerted change in our atmospheric chemistry, a number of greenhouse gases, including carbon dioxide, methane, and nitrous oxide. It seems to be moving collectively through both land use and energy production through the last several centuries. What I like to note is that as we look at the nitrous oxide, you know, a lot of this is related to the amount of reactive nitrogen that we create and use. So this is a combination of both the fixed nitrogen in our fertilizers that we apply, as well as the addition of biological nitrogen-fixing crops and other industrial practices. But the amount of nitrogen that we actually create as fertilizer through the Haber-Bosch process is really quite phenomenal. And so this continues to rise into this century, this millennium, and it far exceeds what our natural capacity in the, I guess, the native ecosystems created over millennium evolution. So as this increased nitrogen and then the overuse of that nitrogen, especially in agricultural practices, which are causing both greenhouse gas emissions of nitrous oxide, we're seeing ammonium volatilization from feedlots, and also eutrophication of our waterways. And we're seeing that exposed throughout the world of these, you know, sort of hypoxia areas in coastal areas throughout the world. And we see this noted in our in our Gulf of Mexico in the dead zone, but you see this also off of China and India as well. So nitrogen is really useful, but then too much of it is really harmful. Oops. And as I indicated, the use of nitrogen and also phosphorus is really important, and you see that it contributes to the increase in cereal production globally. However, what we're seeing, especially in many of the developed countries, in emerging economies, the overuse of nitrogen really hasn't been beneficial for crop production. And so there's been, especially in a recent analysis that Peter Vitusik and myself and others contributed recently in a policy forum in Science, we sort of looked at, how do we actually narrow this gap in a way of applying the right amount of nitrogen to agricultural systems and learning from what, through best practices, how do we manage nitrogen in a way to reduce its emissions both into the atmosphere and to our waterways. As I mentioned before, and you saw, we discussed about fossil emissions and its contribution to CO2 and greenhouse gas emissions. One of the things that's really noteworthy in this suite of lines here, these are the emission scenarios used in the past 4 IPCC reports, Intergovernmental Panel of Climate Change reports that we have used to look at tracking, what are the projected impacts or changes of emissions on the climate. And if you note this particular line, this A1B is sort of, it was considered an aggressive emission scenario in the sense that this was one where, as they developed this in the late 1990s, early 2000s, this emission scenario thought, this would be an upper bound that we would in fact be, because of efforts to reduce our emissions, to improve our conservation and efficiency, that we actually be below that line. And in fact, our emissions have tracked that A1F1 line quite well. When we started, when the Global Carbon Project started collecting this information and compiling it and reporting this back in 2005, when the first time they did this, they were quite alarmed, saying it's amazing how poorly we're doing and how much more urgent our need to curtail our fossil emissions really is needed. This downturn in 2009 is reflective of the economic downturn. So our economic processes is definitely involved in this. And they then, sort of predict, as we project forward, that we'll be back on track. And so, again, the concern and disappointment that happened 2 years ago in Copenhagen when they failed to come to a negotiation of finding ways of negotiating for emission cap globally is quite disconcerting. We still struggle to try to come up with a policy instrument to make that sort of global action work. And how do we actually then define, or can we define, a carbon pricing mechanism to help reduce the emissions that we have and also pay for other transitions related to energy production and conservation that's necessary. So as we see this, one of the big signs in our commons that we're having a big effect is looking at the collective increases in greenhouse gases and their impact on global climate. And so this is a picture that all of us should be familiar with, this type of tracking over time. And what we see now is that we're getting close to 390 parts per million in the atmosphere, and there's no sign of that slowing down. The other aspect of looking at the sort of global signatures of things changing in our Earth system and the global commons is this sort of last decade of climate records compiled by NOAA, by NASA, by the UK Met Office, and they all indicate that we're actually seeing continued increases in temperature, and some of the skeptics had indicated that this downturn after '98 was an indication that climate warming was really a fallacy. But then we see that back in 2009 or 2010 that we've actually come back. It's actually continued to stay warm, and so it's quite an incredible record that we're seeing being portrayed and demonstrated across the globe. some of the more regional effects, this particular year again shows a great decline in the summer minimum of the Arctic ice extent. And the 2010 or 2011 extent is almost equal to the, I believe it was 2008, that was the lowest, or 2007, that was the lowest area covered. And so it continues to recede. And you have important international discussions going on now about, as the waterways open and resources are open to exploration and exploitation, how do we manage those Arctic resources? And there's mineral, there's biological, there are oil and gas finds. They're quite rich in this area, but then it's a very demanding environment to actually work in. How do we actually then also, as changes in the geography take place along the coastal margins, how do we actually define where the political boundaries and who has political rights to these resources? Oren Young here, as part of the Bren School, has actually been quite active in looking at Arctic governance issues, and actually has been one of the leaders in looking at the institutional issues surrounding this. He's been working with a colleague of mine, Bob Corral from the Heinz Center, and looking at these issues over the last several years. And it's been quite important set of discussions at the highest levels of ministries of environment, prime ministers, of looking at those issues. And I think it's really, he's just one example of the type of quality of faculty that you have here. This is also sort of indicative of some of the changes that we're seeing. I was just at the Grinnell Glacier 2 weeks ago. Christina and I were there, and it was quite amazing to be in Glacier National Park, and being able, looking at some of the places that we're actually studying in our research. The actual ice retreat is if you had to look at now, is even greater decline or great lack or decrease in ice levels in this area. It was amazing to actually get on the edge here and walk onto the ice 2 weeks ago to see how much it's actually changed. And Dan Faegre, who we work with in our research project, provided some of these historic photos for us to look at. And it was just really hit home how rapidly these continental ice sheets are retreating, and causing issues related to sea level rise. And these are some of the projections. And as indicated in a number of reports, after the AR4 or the IPCC 2007 report came out, that actually this was a gross underestimate because of new findings of the speed at which the Greenland ice sheet was melting and moving into the ocean. And so you could see the dramatic changes in the projections that the science community is looking at now in way of potential sea level rises. And then what does that mean sort of regionally? You see this sort of remarkable panoramic shot of the world where we're seeing changes of 400 kilometers in certain areas, 150 kilometers inland of sea level rise. This is a 1 meter sea level rise without adaptation. All the low-lying nations, island nations, are definitely under threat and very vulnerable. But even these highly populated areas, in Southeast Asia, South Asia, and the coastal areas is where a lot of people live. So just the impact on various vulnerable populations, and the issue of migration, environmental migrants because of these sea level rises is quite remarkable. You know, it's interesting that the country of Guyana, where I was working a couple of years ago on some carbon sequestration work, their capital city, Georgetown, is actually already a meter below sea level, and so it's not going to take much on way of storm surges, and they're trying to come up with resources to move their capital city inland if they can get the resources, and they're hoping to use carbon trading, forest conservation trading with that Norway's providing to actually help with that sort of transition. In places that I work in Colorado, throughout the Rocky Mountains, we're seeing emerging insect outbreaks. We're seeing disease, other issues emerging. Again, sort of looking at the whole biological system and the impacts that we're having on the biological resources, the ecosystem services that we took for granted. We're seeing these dramatic changes, and this is work that colleagues, Jesse Logan and others, Jeff Hickey, and we're doing with Christina across the Rocky Mountains and this sort of region, looking at their impacts on ecosystem processes, on biogeochemical cycles, on habitat. And it's quite dramatic as we look at the emergence of these insect outbreaks and diseases. Some information that Tom Lovejoy from the Heinz Center pulled together and provided to me was, looking at, looking at, some of the biological changes in phenology, working with the USGS Phenology Network, and we see that we're seeing dramatic range shifts occurring already, and so trying to understand the implication of species migration, species shifts in light of ecosystem processes is something that is really a challenging effort, because we've historically looked at ecosystems sort of as this collection of functional types and processes, but now, as the composition of these ecosystems start changing, and a good example of that, again, dealing with pine bark beetle, is the white bark pine demise to the white bark pine beetle, and its cascading effects on the grizzly bear, on the jay's nutcatcher. I'm not a bird person, so I think it's, yeah. Thank you. That it's because of the lack of the seed source of this long-lived pine tree, the white bark pine, it's really having a devastating effect, or potentially an effect, on the type of energy source that the grizzly bears use for overwintering, and also for the nuthatch. For other bird populations and things. So it has a cascading effect, and because it's a long-lived tree species, it's very slow to regenerate. There's a lot of concern about the ecosystem dynamics then that will take place with the loss of this keystone species, the white bark pine. And this graph emphasizes the rate of extinctions that we're seeing over the last century or more. And this has caused, or energized a whole effort in the international community, so that now there's a new program, the Intergovernmental Panel on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services. It's a whole new initiative akin to the Intergovernmental Panel of Climate Change, to where we're taking an assessment of what changes are we really seeing globally in biodiversity. Can we quantify that and actually then understand its implications on ecosystem services and processes? And so their meeting, I believe, is happening this fall. There's been a series of preliminary meetings, but now within the UN structure, the IPBEX is moving forward, and it's really an important activity internationally to really get a better understanding of the rate of which biodiversity is being impacted, and how it's influencing ecosystem services. Oops. That in addition to some of these direct effects that we have on the commons, through our own movement and globalization of trade, we're seeing impacts of things, and this is just a picture, a cartoon of a carbon, embedded carbon related to trade. And you see that not only is the United States involved with emitting and being the second largest emitter of carbon in the atmosphere, but also because of our trade, we have an additional contribution, if you can use that word, on the carbon cycle and effects on resources around the world. And so this very large curve, especially from indicating the trade from China into the United States of goods, really reflects an additional contribution of emissions that we, I guess, produce and responsible for. And this example of looking at carbon and the role of trade then is incorporated into the work that Helmut Haberl and his group out of Vienna is doing. And if you're not familiar with that, I'd be happy to share these papers, because he's been quantifying the human appropriation of potential net primary production. And this is he's really following on the foundational work that Peter Vitusik and Hal Mooney did back in, I believe it was in the early 90s. But they've been able to document, about approximately 25% of the, or a quarter of the potential NPP, the natural net primary productivity, is being used by humans directly. And you can see that it's not uniform, that there are areas in the Midwest, there's areas in South Asia, areas throughout East Asia and China that have quite heavy toll on the natural resources and the NPP there. And a lot of that's quite useful, but the question is, how much can we take from nature? How much of these ecosystem services can we use without damaging the system? And so that's an area of research that a lot of us are undertaking. So just looking at sort of these trends related to the global condition, and a lot of these next 4 slides are coming from this report that the European Environmental Agency has pulled together in the state of these global changes, global trends. And so they're using this assumption of looking at a peak population level of 9 billion people by 2050, that the characteristics of this population is an aging population. We're both longer lived, higher consumption rates associated with that, and that they'll anticipate seeing greater numbers of environmental migrants occurring over the next century. And as you well know, populations are becoming more urbanized, and so we just in the past decade exceeded 50% of our population being urban in built environments, and that this will continue to grow. And associated with that then is this increased consumption patterns that we have. So the type of diet that we select, the type of energy use that we have, the type of transportation systems that we have will all lead toward increased consumption because of associated with the urbanization. There are probably strategies we can develop to actually decouple that to a certain extent, but really that's part of the solution set of how do we innovate and rethink how our urban environments operate. We also are seeing changes in economic growth. We're seeing, again, this acceleration because of the emerging economies that are developing, and we're seeing acceleration of consumption. Some of that economic growth actually might support innovation, but that's a big question mark. Can we actually develop and use some of the surplus economic growth into ways that really looks into the future and develop innovative strategies toward green development? That's actually this whole topic is one which is foremost in the upcoming Rio +20 meeting this June, where the UN Commission on Sustainable Development is having its summit. And so it is, 20 years, how fast time goes since the 1992 Earth Summit in Rio. And so they're looking at a focal set of discussions on green development strategies. We're looking at a world that it's more multipolar. We're seeing, because of the emergence of the Asian economies, both in India and China, really changing the dynamics of trade and the economic, financial world. You've seen these emerging markets and changes in production systems. And you're seeing the influence of activities related to resource extraction from China into places like Africa, Latin America, other areas of Southeast Asia. So these emerging markets really are impacting the whole dynamic and set of equations that had been sort of set forward in the last 50 years, the last half of the 20th century. And this sort of just encapsulates some of the work that Helmut and his group related to the human appropriations of NPP, up to 25% is being utilized, and looking at cropping systems, we're seeing that 53% of that is being used for crop production. This actually, in his estimates and in recent analysis in the global trends, indicates that this will go up, and actually the amount, this will start moving up to about 30% by 2050. We're seeing this overexploitation and resulting in soil erosion and other degradation of our land systems and loss of biodiversity, and both impacting land and ocean resources. This marine resources is really quite alarming, that we have this large impact on the oceans, that our overexploitation of marine fish stocks is quite dramatic. And in addition to that, sort of the wild card that is just emerging in the last 5 years of research is this whole impact of an observation of ocean acidification on the plankton and sort of the foundation of the food web in the oceans, and how this increased absorption of CO2 in the oceans causing the pH changes, which then dissolves a lot of the planktonic silica shells and calcium carbonate aragonite formations of the plankton, the primary producers of the oceans, is really being impacted. And how that will cascade, we don't know. Ocean acidification is one of those things that's going to be very, very difficult to geoengineer around. And many of the geoengineering fixes actually ignore ocean acidification, and so it's something that it's going to be really important for us to keep track of and try to figure out solutions for. Then this continued increase impacts due to the biogeochemical cycles because of reactive nitrogen and how it's being produced, and also the understanding of how changes in particulates, black carbon, dust, other aerosols are really, are increasing. Some of them have, sort of beneficial aspects in the way of iron fertilization of the oceans, but also has impacts on the cloud condensation nuclei in the atmosphere, changes in the emissivity of the atmosphere, and also then locally, at least in Colorado and in the Rocky Mountains, dust on snow, something that I think Jeff Dozier and other colleagues, other students of his have been looking at in the West. The impact of that on melting snow and the hydrology has really been quite dramatic. And it's just been, Tom Painter and others have been looking at that in just in the last decade. So now we segue really quickly into a series of slides, just little vignettes on water, land, and energy systems, and try to sort of focus in on the sectoral perspectives, and then look at sort of what are communities doing both internationally and locally to deal with these issues, and then sort of wrap up with sort of how they're all tied together. So I don't have to say much about water. I mean, everyone sort of knows that water is really essential. These are a set of bullets that Kofi Annan in the Earth Summit in Johannesburg, I believe, really started bringing home as they talked about the Millennium Development Goals, about the importance of water and the necessity to really come to sort of an international agreement of how do we safeguard our water supply. And it's amazing that we are a blue planet, we have a lot of water, but really such a very small fraction is really available to us as potable water, fresh water. And just this type of relationship of understanding how little and how fragile that water asset is to us on a planet so rich in water is quite amazing. Again, just as a backdrop, we know that agriculture is the main user of water, and because of that, it has a big impact on water quality as well as water availability. We see, still increasing competition between these other sectors, and we see that industrial use in the future can be will be increasing, and especially in semi-arid regions of the world, that can be quite important as these can impact water quality that impacts not only food production but also human health issues as well because of the changes in water quality. We're seeing already areas of the world that are stressed by water availability. This will get only exacerbated with climate change and changes in rainfall patterns and regimes. And so as we look forward, looking at various international actions, what are we saying that we need to do? We understanding that they have these multiple needs in society. So how do we meet these complex needs that that are necessary for food production or for further energy development? So internationally, this comes from the looking at the EU framework. What they're articulating in way of looking at water management is looking at mitigating risks, looking at understanding and coping with uncertainty and water availability and quality, looking at issues of water sharing, defining these in a collaborative way with partnerships across multi-sectors, understanding the various values that water is used, and then looking at this sort of governance structures where water is governed in a sustainable way, across international boundaries and done in a collective way. And so I think they're looking at water, and I think California is as well really looking at it as a collective resource and looking at the multiple benefits, but then also the multiple challenges it represents. Oops. Let's go back. So again, so as they're looking at their adaptation strategies, they're looking at sort of getting all partners involved, multiple sectors, looking at rethinking some of their policies of the water structures and water availability, and actually trying to incorporate climate proofing in thinking through their water policies, because they understand that climate is changing, it's affecting the precipitation patterns and what have you. They're incorporating their water thinking into both their mitigation and adaptation strategies, as well as looking at how do you actually bring all the partners, the urban, the built environment discussions with agriculture, with industry, and conservation all together in a partnership to really look at what are the appropriate pathways forward. And then in addition, looking at improving or enhancing cooperation for common actions across these different needs that these nation states represent. And that's sort of a common formula for many of the actions that are needed in a way of conserving the land ecosystem services or looking at energy development. So this would be a common set of general themes that emerge as we look at solutions. So as I mentioned, in the Western governance, or in this part of the world, we're looking at how do we actually understand that we can't sustain unlimited growth, but how do we actually enhance quality of life under these changing times, and that, you know, really coming to grips with what type of political choices that we need to make so that we have both economic development and sustained environmental uses. You know, it really is calling for this change in thinking about the future. And that sort of sets the stage for how we look at land systems and looking at how do we prepare sort of adapting to climate change in this framework of looking at cultural and societal settings that we have that blends the ecosystem components with other needs for land systems, and especially in light of food production. And one of the things that we see that is really impacting food production, and this one sort of facet, is the food price index that that FAO tracks in a lot of the agricultural agencies. And so we're seeing this really dramatic impact on food prices, and then a sort of adjustment, and then again an increase in this last decade. And sort of the volatility of this is really alarming because it affects not only what happens on the farm, but it also happens in, you know, what happens in the grocery store and consumers, and under, I guess, in poor populations of different communities. So we're seeing that, you know, as we look at this, the analysis is that, you know, the current state of the market is really because of this tight connection between food, feed, and bioenergy. They're causing this sort of high volatility in markets. The volatility in the markets and its linkages to other markets is really being played out, and also the development of new financial commodity trading mechanisms is really also impacting the volatility of the prices on the market. On the supply side, we were also, you know, at least in 2008, we're seeing impacts of droughts and production systems being impacted across in very important regions of the world. So in the 8 most productive regions of the world, we saw a 4 to 7% drop in production from 2005 to 2006. So that impacts the stock of available cereals and other commodities, so that the whole global stock levels fell quite considerably in the last 20 years. And then in addition, you know, sort of the linkage to increased fuel costs and that affects operations and transportation was quite dramatic in causing the prices of food to go up. And on the demand side, we're also seeing great changes in food consumption patterns. We're seeing that food for fuel competition really getting played out, especially for corn ethanol and sugars. And then this whole volatility also is associated with new market instruments. And so these all played out into seeing this highly dramatic change in commodity pricing. So we're really struggling with how do we actually feed 7 billion people now, 9 billion by 2050. You know, what are the integrated approaches that we need to make to provide the goods and services and the food products that we have? How do we actually link investment and advancements that tie science, technology to incorporate best practices? A number of these practices are known, especially related to nitrogen, carbon storage, irrigation, but how do we actually get that accepted by operators and incorporated with these different systems? And it'll take some incentives that will make that possible. And so creating these public policies and incentives are really important. And sort of making this sort of linkage between production and conservation is really an important linkage, that something that is only emerging in the broad global field of agricultural sciences. So as we look at sustainability, this is an initiative that I've been involved with for the last couple of years. The UN Foundation, the Heinz Center, and a number of other NGOs and private sector communities are joining together to look at how do we actually look at better sustainability practices from land production systems. And so what we, sort of our goal is to satisfy domestic global demands, reduce hunger, improve soil quality, water quality, air quality, and enhance biodiversity as we produce our, the needed amount of food. And, sort of summing things up, and this is from a paper that Tom Tomich from Davis put together with his group, sort of how do we actually move forward is sort of looking at how do we integrate towards a systems thinking. And I think, and that's a bias of mine. I'm an ecosystem scientist, so I really like systems thinking. So how do we actually do this in a way that links agroecology, global change, social values, brings in conservation, biodiversity issues? How do we protect and enhance soil biodiversity, which oftentimes gets ignored? And then how do we transition agricultural systems that really link the understandings of inputs and outputs? It really gets into life cycle analysis or end-to-end analysis in a very important way. And then you're seeing companies like the Mars family, Mars Corporation, other major food processing companies coming in trying to develop frameworks to actually incorporate this. And so been working with a number of groups now on looking at sustainable food systems. This last sort of vignette is on energy. And the Global Energy Assessment, which just completed its report, should be coming out actually sometime this fall, has really set out this goal of looking at energy systems and their challenges to look really into the 21st century of how do we transition our current energy system so that it's more distributed, it's more accessible, that it is less environmentally damaging. And so, and they're looking at, sort of both from the private sector side and also from policy and other societal dimensions, how do we actually do this in a way? So this assessment is really a novel one that really tries to look at these transitions in a way that's both practical and needed. Part of that then is how do we look at affordable, available, and secure energy, and how we do this in an equitable way. And so especially for over 2 billion people who do not have access to readily available energy. We do this, they're doing this by, sort of resolving, looking at, sort of indoor or local to regional environment actions, looking at how do we actually rethink production, transport, processing activities so that we reduce the impacts related to air pollution and regional acidification, so environmental impacts, local to regional impacts, and how we do this in a way that also provides climate mitigation, because we're now looking at processes which are zero emission or near zero emission or reduced emission. And so that's a very large effort. And what they're looking at are things related to decarbonizing our energy system, using things like carbon capture storage, gasification of coal, those type of industrial activities. Increased efficiency is always important, and we're making great headways there, but we need to do that in a way that doesn't further degrade our ecosystem resources. How do we actually look at distributed power systems, production, looking at smart grids, and looking at ways of providing financial incentives and subsidies to other power development systems. And so those are things that they're recommending in their report. Looking at, you're seeing this play out in some of the current activities. For instance, the EU with African nations are developing this large and innovative solar array with high, low, or high transmission lines that have that carries power with low loss of energy during the transmission, so they could have this sort of large solar array in the Saharan desert, and then use it in Europe. We're seeing advances currently in biotechnology related to bioenergy, and one example or some of the work that some of our research groups at Colorado State University are doing with algae production, and then we're looking at different incentives for solar production, looking at how do we scale up carbon capture storage, and then I think this issue of carbon pricing is really important so that you have the economic resources to actually make some of these other things possible. An example that's locally I'm proud of, in Fort Collins, we have this Fort Zed, which is a zero emissions district. And so it's built around availability of renewable energy sources. They're using smart grid that colleagues of mine at Colorado State University have developed. So they really are looking at implementing in a downtown area near the CSU campus and with large energy consumers in our area, ways of promoting conservation and use of renewable sources. So we're looking at a smart grid so that we could distribute the power, balance loads, those sorts of things effectively in this little area of Fort Collins. And the key thing is that it's a partnership between the city, the university, and private sector investments to look from the clean energy sector. And that partnership has been really effective and important to make this happen. One of the things that, as we move forward, one of the things of looking at how do we actually reduce our vulnerability, improve our resilience, this paper by Seitz that came out just recently is really interesting because she points out that it's really important of understanding and incorporating social and technological ingenuity and rewarding that in a way that provides a much more sustainable pathway in our development aspects. The example she was giving was more in a semi-arid system, so that was what was appealing to me because of the work I do in semi-arid systems. But I think it's the general rules that she presents in the paper in way of looking at reducing our vulnerabilities, increasing our resilience is really important. And that's a concept that we're going to be exploring more in the course that I'm doing. Okay. I'm going to now just spend the last 2 minutes on looking at sort of the toll. If we don't take action on taking in way of climate actions, it's been estimated that there's $20 trillion of costs that will incur in way of damages by 2100, by the end of this century. Yet, if we start investing now in mitigation options, that it would be less than $1 trillion by 2050, the accumulated cost, and by 2100, it would be $3 trillion by the end of this century. So the actual cost savings would be quite large if we can get the political will and have the financial instruments to take action. And that's been very difficult, as we noted on the failure in Copenhagen. So this graphically, this is from this report that the Germans did recently. You can see, sort of those numbers that I just talked about in way of hundreds of billions of dollars invested in what they accumulate. But then this would be the total damage, the 20 million about 20 trillion about in 2100, the type of impacts and damages accrued without taking action, with taking some action in 2200 compared to not taking action and the tremendous economic cost that we would incur. So there's a large differential then of taking policy actions now and what the cost would be and compared to the actual damage incurred to what we would incur if we did not take action. So what we are seeing is that additional damages would incur, and especially on vulnerable populations and ecosystems, these will be impacted. In addition to that, we'll see potential conflicts between nations because of resource needs due to the inactions, and things like environmental migrants will be accelerated due to these problems. So these are additional costs to society that we need to account for. And looking at sort of what's happening within the UN system, especially in its discussions of the Millennium Development Goals and the Rio +20, can we make headway? Can we actually get financial and international actions to take place? And so some of that's being discussed in preparation for the Rio meeting, but the initial assessment is that our financial commitment and our activities related to meeting the goals are very, very poorly formulated and implemented. We don't actually have a mechanism to look at multiple benefits of various conventions and the issue related to reduce emissions from deforestation and land degradation that is a part of the carbon sequestration and forest conservation efforts is not well formulated, and it's lagging behind what's needed. And then do summits like Rio +20 really make a difference? How much can you just talk versus how much do we implement? How do we actually provide mechanisms for taking action? So in summary, we really need to figure out a way to reverse this impact, because we're seeing the collective toll around us. We're seeing the Earth system unravel, but yet we're not taking the appropriate actions. So what are the mechanisms for sustainable development? How do we actually not only find the solutions, but then also find ways of implementing them? Can we develop a global ethics to where these goals can be met? How do we actually look at the distribution and access to these ecosystem services that are more equitable, that we actually provide a value system to where we protect and enhance our ecosystem services? And then this whole question of who and how will we pay for the damages or the fixes in the coming decades is really unclear. And so the final summary is this: we need to take a collective, integrative set of actions, and we need to do this quickly with engagement and partnerships across the world. And so with that, I'll stop.